distant northern skies. At that point, I realized I don't know where it comes from, but I know it's okay. If this is all an illusion, then I'm willing to play.
Welcome to Karen Holton's podcast. Karen permanently lost 178 pounds and found happiness and success by following her own advice. She has now developed that advice into the quantum health transformation: heal, evolve, and thrive. Karen's website offers a free webinar workshop series, and you'll also find tools, methods, and practices to assist you to become the change you want to see in the world. She believes that we are all connected. Heal the planet by healing yourself. Connect with Karen at her website, KarenHoltonHealthCoach.com, and through Facebook at Facebook.com/Quantum Health Transformation. Now for the podcast.
Today I want to talk a little bit about medicine, and specifically Western medicine, or the type of medicine where we go to the doctor, we have a problem, he gives us pills. Where did this all come from? How did this all get started? Where did they get their bank of knowledge that they are making their decisions on? How did all of this come about? And what's really interesting is how it's so tied in with the suppression of the divine feminine, the suppression of humanitarian values and power. It is so linked in to what's going on today. We really need to go back and have a look. So I'm going to start with the history of Western medicine today. And I'm taking the information from an article I wrote in 2000 called Medicine, Social Attitudes, and Women's Bodies in the 19th Century. I will attempt to find, somehow I have this on disk somewhere or in my computer, and I will attempt to add at the end of the podcast all my endnotes and my bibliography. But in the meantime, I'm just going to read to you from this article. And of course, you know how I am, going down one rabbit hole or another. I'll stop and make comments and then get back into the article. You may not actually get a clear mark of where the article stops and where my commentary starts. And I do apologize for that, but it's better just for me to do these podcasts and get the information out there than to worry about being perfect. So here we go. This is the history, actually the more recent history from a Canadian perspective of the suppression of feminine energy and also the emergence at the same time as of the medical industry. The 19th century was a period of great change. All of Europe experienced intense political upheaval as the economic system moved from a mercantile system to an industrial capitalist system. There were wars, a great famine in Ireland, and many political changes. Slavery was abolished in all the British colonies, including Canada, in 1838. The Catholic Church was losing its influence. Science was replacing superstition. Darwin's theory of evolution was becoming well known, and there was the dawning of the medical industry, because, like, the human ovum was only discovered in 1832. The myth of the cult of the true woman was at its peak. This is very interesting to see how medical science, attitudes towards women, and gender all interplay. In Canada, there was a transition in the economy from the fur trade to industrial capitalism. Remember, this is all about the 19th century here, which is in the 1800s, which is basically my grandmother's Mother's Day. The British became well established after the War of 1812. Stable boundaries were formed, and finally Confederation occurred in 1867. There was mass immigration to Canada from Europe, especially from Britain, as well as the post-loyalists, former slaves, and others from America. It was a time of great migration throughout the land as settlement was established and the indigenous peoples were forced onto reserves. Religion, technology, and scientific theories flourished. Gender was affected by industrialization, politics, economics, and philosophy. Women became increasingly restricted in Canada as a result of the influence of the Loyalist settlers and of this Victorian ideal that was called the cult of domesticity. Now, that's all fine and dandy to talk about, but we got to really look at what this means. In 1832, the very same year that the human ovum was discovered, a law was passed in Canada that women were not allowed to have the franchise. And what that meant was that they were not allowed to own anything. They were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to own their children. They were not allowed to own their possessions. And if a woman displeased her husband in any way, he could give her the boot and she was out. And she was not allowed to take anything with her or her children. She would never see them again. So this is a pretty, basically very similar to slavery, which is interesting that it was abolished in 1812. And then this law came about in 1832 that suppressed all women of all ethnic backgrounds. Not only could women not own anything, but it was also very legal in Canada for men to beat their women and to beat their children. And they got to beat pretty much anyone they wanted. And just a little side note here, if you want to look into the suffragette movement, that was a response to this. That was at the same time as this. And it was okay for a man to come home from work, especially lower or middle class men or any man, and go to the bar and drink up all the money and come home and beat the wife. And this went on. This was a normal part of Canadian culture. This was acceptable. This was legally mandated. In fact, there is a saying that says, rule of thumb. Where did that saying come from? That saying came from this very same time period in Canada. It was legal to beat your wife, of course, with your hands, fists, feet, anything that's part of his body, but he was also allowed to use an instrument that, as long as it was no wider than his thumb, rule of thumb, he could beat his wife with it. He could beat her as much as he wanted or as often as he wanted to. So, the suffragette movement was absolutely a response to that. So this is the type of reality that was not only accepted, but was considered normal. And this was in my grandmother's Mother's Day. This is less than 200 years ago. So if men want to know why women get all uppity, maybe they need to listen to this. So getting back to the article, false perceptions about women, social roles, and the growth of medical science were tightly integrated. Class divisions became more pronounced, and medical intervention affected upper class and middle class women very differently than working class or lower class women. Medical attitudes towards women's bodies initially reflected social attitudes, but eventually it distorted them. To understand the interrelation of the medical industry and the social roles of women, one needs to explore the 19th century attitudes toward the supposed biological differences between men and women, as well as the ways that changes in technology, scientific knowledge, and medical involvement added to this milieu. The basic belief of the time was that all women were to some extent ill. This was biologically determined and dictated by nature. Along with this was the belief that women's natural characteristics included nurturance, intuitive morality, passivity, and affection. The goal of the 19th century woman was to become a genteel lady of fashion with ideals of femininity, and these qualities were unavoidably rooted in biology. Women were considered lower on the evolutionary scale than men, and it was believed that they had a much higher tolerance for pain. Women had smaller brains, and that's why they were not regarded as being as smart, capable, rational, or healthy as men. Some of these beliefs were influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, which was hot at the time. High-class women were considered more delicate and frail. In fact, the higher her class, the more medical intervention she needed. During the 19th century, it was believed that a woman's susceptibility to sickness showed how refined and civilized she was. And of course, the higher class ladies were the only ones who could afford to pay the doctors that were now coming out of history. Another little side note, bubonic plague. also helped to spur the dawn of the medical industry. And in fact, there was treatments for bubonic plague at the time, and thieves oil, which we use today, came about from basically the economy was so destabilized that the perfume merchants and spice merchants, they all lost their jobs. So they were out robbing bodies and removing things of value. And of course, this was against the law. And so they would get arrested, and then that's when the doctors got their secret. So they tricked them into giving them their secret. They said, give us a secret, we won't burn you. So they gave them the secret, which is thieves oil, and they hung them instead. So then the doctors started wearing these big beak-like masks that were stuffed with rags and soaked in thieves oil, and that way they were able to go out and tend to sick people and not get sick. Lesson, thieves oil today still works. Okay, so getting back to the article, and the emergence of the medical industry, and that only high-class women could pay for medical care. Of course, they found lots wrong with the higher-class women. But there's actually even more to it than that. It was taken for granted that all women would be prone to illness. However, sickness was encouraged among the higher classes and ignored amongst the lower. Surprise, surprise. Isn't it interesting today that we have a two-tier system in Canada where if you can pay, you get wonderful health care? And this whole idea that poor people get good health care in Canada, that's poppycock. And I'll get into that in another podcast, because today we're dealing with the history of Western medicine. So another side note, on a spiritual level, this culture of the time suppressed the divine feminine. Women basically had no value other than producing children, looking good. Now, isn't that still around today? Wow. Poor women were expected just to work themselves to death. And that's what I'm going to get into a little bit here. Women of the lower classes were ignored because of the common belief that they were healthier and stronger and felt much less pain. So it was considered a fact that men could not tolerate pain at all. Upper class women could tolerate enough pain, but lower class women, they were just beasts of burden. They don't feel pain. Just like a lot of people look at animals today and go, they don't feel pain, they're animals, they're food. What do we care how they feel? We just want them to taste good. Same ideology flowing through time. So we look back at this and we see how archaic it is. But why are we still doing all this jazz today? The health of these, meaning lower class women, often suffered due to being overworked, having unsafe work conditions, and the constant threat of starvation. For many of them, sickness was a way of life, and for the most part, there was little sympathy from doctors, probably because these women just didn't have the money to pay for care. Now, a really good thing that came out of this was poor and working class women then had to rely on folk medicine. So women's ways of knowing and women's ways of healing were actually preserved amongst the lower classes. And I am speaking from a Canadian context here. And what's happened is today, there's just a flourishing of healers and alternative health practitioners because we kept that sacred wisdom on how to heal the body, the mind, the body, the spirit. We kept that alive. So thank God for poverty and for poor women. Getting back to the article. Medical ideology sprang from the fundamental belief by medical experts of the 19th century that the uterus controlled the woman's body. It was supposed to be extremely excitable and was connected by nerves and pathways to every part of her body. Some even believed that it gave the woman both physical and mental characteristics. Every part of the woman's being was somehow connected to her reproductive organs and were considered to govern her thoughts, beauty, and essence of womanhood. Every disease was a sympathetic reaction to the disease affecting the uterus. Even tuberculosis was commonly believed to be caused by the uterus. And a common cure was to remove the uterus. And that's still happening today. The social roles of femininity were also considered symptoms of disease, and the doctors were intent on finding a cure. So they're not just trying to find a cure for disease, they were trying to find a cure for femininity. They pathologized menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and women that were lucky enough to reach menopause were considered terminally ill. Now this is still going on today. Today we still see the medicalization of women's bodies. Women are medicalized about all the issues around menstruation, which is a perfectly natural and sacred thing to have happen. Pregnancy. How many women give birth at home compared to how many in a hospital? Pregnancy became medicalized. Childbirth. And menopause, absolutely. You know, ever since I turned 50, when I go to the doctor for anything, it's always the same old story. Oh, they say, you know, this is normal. You're supposed to be shutting down now. Your body's preparing for death. And I think poppycock. In many, many cultures all around the world, people live healthy until they're old and then they just die one day. Or they decide, I've had enough of this shit, I'm out of here. And they go. There is no all palliative care and hospice and sickness and institutions and pills. No, none of that. They're part of the community, they live well, and then they die. Getting back to the article, because of the uterus, women's existence was considered to be for the sole purpose of reproduction. This ideology promoted the idea that reproduction of children was essential to a woman's health, like the air she breathed and the food she consumed. This was taken so seriously that women were told not to enjoy the sex act and not to move during intercourse because it might interfere with conception. Doctors also worried that if women ever awoke to their lust, they would be destroyed by their cravings. Oh, dear. So again, fear of women's power, fear of the divine feminine was being suppressed by this emerging medical industry. The other thing I want to say is they didn't go to traditional systems and wisdoms of learning for health. They only went to dead bodies, and they only went through the budding cult of science. Using the scientific method, they only just experimented, and through disastrous results came up with a few things that help people. So getting back to the article, partly due to the increased use of medical interventions, women of the New World, meaning Canada, usually had very difficult birth deliveries, and some were so weak afterwards that they could not look after their households. And we are seeing that still today. Doctors were often unsympathetic and blamed their condition on nerves. Oh, we use science. This can't be wrong. So there's something wrong with you. Putting that onto the woman and not taking the responsibility for what's going on with science and medicine. Getting back to the article, because of the perceived frailty of upper-class women, it was believed that sensory deprivation was necessary for their bodies to heal. They were not permitted to read or have visitors because it was believed that the mind had to be completely at rest or the bodies wouldn't heal. Again, suppression of women's power, suppression of the divine feminine, suppression of all creativity of women. And of course, the poorer women were all in the workhouses. So, suppression all around. Among the many notions of the time was the ideology of separate spheres that was constructed during the Victorian era. Women were continually socialized to fit within the ideology that were influenced by everything from religious sermons to magazines. So they were inundated, just like we are today, of what's supposed to be real, the construct telling us what's real. They were inundated with the messages that women's bodies were designed for domestic responsibilities and not suited to outside work. And this was dictated by nature, not society. Remember, the law also supported suppression of women in 1832. So in 1832, until much later, about 100 years, close to 100 years, women had to fit this idea that was modern at the time. They had no other option for reality if they wanted to survive. Getting back to the article, by appearing scientific and appealing to nature, physicians suggested that it was biological adaptation and part of natural selection that women stay home and take care of the domestic work. This thinking influenced social roles, and social roles influenced medical science, resulting in the cult of the true woman, also known as the cult of domesticity, which had a huge influence on the social roles of women during the 19th century, and I would say even today. As a result of a growing middle class and the emergence of a professional class, there was a strong need to possess a personal haven of peace created by the woman, who was always there, and whose sole purpose was to maintain and manage the haven and minister to the needs of the man who provided it. so that he could retire from the cares and the anxieties of the world. There was less work for these middle-class women to do, and so they retreated into domesticity and the running of the households and the rising domestic standard. By the second half of the 19th century, women were required to live in such a way that caused them to become sick, and the sickness in turn affected the way they lived. This vicious cycle of repressed ambition and illness legitimized the perception that women were delicate and dependent on their husbands. In addition, upper-class men felt that the right kind of wife could increase his status in a way that money could not. A delicate wife who was ignorant of the male world, virtuous, sedentary, and idle, was the perfect social adornment. So we're still seeing this today. Women killing themselves because they're trying to be skinnier and buying all this crap so that they think it makes them look prettier. And all of this is still the tail end of the 18th century and the brainwashing job they did through the construct reality at the time for everybody. So we still see trophy brides today. Donald Trump has a trophy bride. This is still going on, and people don't even realize what it is, what its purpose is, what it's suppressing, what they're missing. Okay, Karen, back to the article. All of these attitudes were so pervasive that women believed these things were not only socially correct, but also medically correct. Nature itself determined the difference between men and women. Doctors promoted this ideology so that it became even more rigid. And by the end of the 19th century, the two pillars of femininity, now this is like 1901, right? This is not that long ago. The two pillars of femininity were considered to be sickness and reproduction. And that's it. A curious disease that affected upper-class women spread throughout North America, England, and Europe. It was called hysteria, and it was believed to cause women to faint, contort their bodies, pull out their hair, bite themselves and others, lose their appetites and voices, cause coughing, sneezing, screaming, laughing, and crying. It is now believed that to legitimize their trade, which means, oh goody, a way for us to become middle class and better, the prevalence of this disease was encouraged by doctors. So they basically made it up and told everybody this is how it is, and this is a terrible disease. And we're still seeing that today with mental illness. That's another podcast. They gave strong support to the idea that women's genteel femininity was unalterably rooted in biology and were more interested in enhancing their own power than improving the health of women. I would say there's evidence that this is still how it is today. Back to the article. In the 19th century, American doctors performed cruel medical experiments on female slaves, and it is now believed that men cut up women's bodies in an attempt to restrain them. Wow, what a perfect haven for the serial killer. Okay, that was my little joke, not to be taken seriously, but in Canada, the experiments were done on Indigenous peoples. Children were experimented on by medical professionals in Canada until the end of the residential schools. So what happened was the residential schools were started in the 1840s. They didn't close till 1996. During that time, people were experimented on. Even after World War II, the children were experimented on. So those Indigenous people and their children who weren't exterminated through the purposeful spread of disease and removal of their culture and all things that made them who they were, they also abused their children, not just sexually, but very much for the medical industry. Okay, get back to the article. So much illness was attributed to the woman that the medical specialty of gynecology emerged before other specialities. Gynecologists argued that it was the reproductive system that caused most of the health problems for women, and that the curing of the reproductive organs was the only way to restore the health of women. And again, the mass removal of ovaries, especially to women that ended up in asylums. Because they were the defective women, they didn't want them reproducing. So the tough birds that ended up somehow staying alive amongst the middle classes, and the ones with the money, and the ones that were the perfect social ornaments, they are the ones that actually got to keep their ovaries because the men wanted to have children with them. So this is all selective breeding, guys. You and I are here as a result of selective breeding. Another story. Okay, getting back to the article. Doctors felt that they had to take over the female body in order to protect women. They feared that the vagina had belonged in the women's sphere for much too long and felt obligated to move it to the realm of medical professionalism for their own good. I'm wondering if the book The Red Tent was a response to these attitudes. That's my own personal comment. The belief that women were basically invalids allowed the medical profession to thrive. Although medical practices of the 19th century were considered scientific, their methods of care included bleeding, purging, poisoning with mercury, easing pain and stress with opium and alcohol, turpentine enemas, the application of leeches, and surgeries done without, until much later in the century, antiseptic or anesthetic. The medical profession was being built upon the cruel trial and error attempts of experimentation on women and children, if you want to include the First Nations people. They did things like applied leeches to the uterus, cauterized the uterus with a white-hot iron, injected the uterus with linseed oil. We still see this more in modern times with chemotherapy and big pharma, what they did to women to treat cancer. They would take radioactive pieces of metal and sew them into their uteruses and all kinds of things. And now we're only talking about 50 to 70 years ago, okay? Today it's chemotherapy and big pharma. Hasn't changed a whole lot. These guys still keeping all their power. In the early 19th century, there was very few formally trained physicians or schools of medicine. And again, like I told you before, they didn't go to the Chinese traditional medicine or Ayurvedic or First Nations. No, because they were white, they thought they were basically a little bit below Christ and above all other humanity. They didn't see any value in any of these. And so they just experimented and played around and screwed with people's bodies and society while they figured out what they wanted to do. And mostly that was about keeping their power. Most doctors treated the middle classes, but there was no real medical science at that time. The medical profession usurped the traditional care of the sick and changed its function to suit itself. So they usurped it from women, and they wanted to keep it to themselves, and with this unique position enhanced its own power more often than it attempted to improve the health of women. I'm going to reread that. The medical profession usurped the traditional care of the sick from women and changed its function to suit itself, and with this unique position enhanced its own power more often than it attempted to improve the health of women. Now, another comment I want to make is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was written during this time. Mary Shelley is one of these women who was forced to stay in her room and be quiet. And I want to point you to a Netflix series called Frankenstein Chronicles or something like that, but it's basically not a true story, but there's a lot of truth within that not true story. And so if you watch that series, you'll really get an idea of this budding medical industry and how doctors approached people and their bodies, and how this was absolutely reflected in the story of Frankenstein. A little bit more about that coming up. Later, medical educational institutions were established at the second quarter of the 19th century. And again, absolutely no respect or input from any of the traditional ways of healing. For thousands of years, it was all rejected. This made it harder for doctors to get their licenses, and more thorough training and education in the new technologies was required. Once medical knowledge advanced and showed that it could relieve the suffering of some individuals, medical power increased substantially, and by the 19th century, doctors were determined to have their profession aligned with the notion of being scientific, because science was quickly becoming a sacred national value. Scientific medicine was developed, was believed to be objective and able to solve society's health and morality problems. We still see this today. Again, a side note, I want to make reference again to Frankenstein. What the doctors tried to do was to keep the body alive, to try to keep the body functioning. There was absolutely no concept of a person's psychological well-being or spiritual well-being. They separated it. And they did all their research on dead bodies. So the whole medical industry is built on necrophiliac type tendencies, obsession with the dead body. Well, the dead body, the spirit is gone. In the dead body, the psychology is gone. In the dead body, you are dealing with something that the men who governed the profession saw like a car or like a tool. And it was our only value is what we would give them because they were the only ones that mattered. This is a very narcissistic reality, and it dominates the white world. Of course, to the harm of everybody. They just want to keep the body alive. Even today, if a horse breaks its leg or gets hurt, they shoot it to put it out of its misery. If an animal is suffering, they euthanize it to put it out of its misery. Now, I'm not saying we should run around and kill sick people. That's not my point here. But my point here is when people are really suffering and they decide it's time for them to leave the planet, that's their personal journey. And yet in Canada, it's against the law. And if anyone hears that somebody else is thinking of taking their own life, they're horrible to them. They pick them up in a puke-filled paddy wagon. They take them to the hospital. They put them under surveillance. They force them to take medicines. Oh my God. They would never do that to another kind of animal, but they do that to people. Why? Because they want us to keep paying our taxes. They want us to get out there and run the construct so that they can have, the 1% can have whatever it is they have, because we don't even know what they have. We've never been privy to it. Okay, getting back to the article. Scientific medicine was developed, was believed to be objective, and able to solve society's health and morality problems. Since knowledge is often obtained by the legitimizing of beliefs, it is frequently impossible to separate knowledge from belief. By the end of the 19th century, hospitals provided environments for doctors where they reigned supreme. Inside or outside of the hospital, physicians had the position of power. The views that society held about women were reflected in the ways that physicians cared for the health of women. In this way, culture affected medicine, and medicine affected social roles. Very much so. And getting back to the doctors reigning supreme, they still are. They still do. A doctor can testify against anybody and get believed, but if someone testifies against a doctor, nobody wants to hear about it. I know. I've had that experience myself. A good example is the case of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whom suffered from a bad case of nerves and was referred to one of the greatest specialists in the country. While she was away, she felt better, but became sick again as soon as she returned home to her husband and her child. The advice from the specialist was for her to lie down every afternoon, have limited intellectual involvement, and never write, paint, or draw for the rest of her life. After following these orders, her health became progressively worse until one day she realized what the problem was. She didn't want to be a wife anymore. She moved away, became a writer and an activist, and 3 years later she wrote a book called The Yellow Wallpaper. The medical profession had become so powerful that sick women had no choice but to seek them for advice. These men believed that all women were weak, dependent, and diseased by nature, and these beliefs promoted and perpetuated even more illness amongst women. There certainly was an interaction between the rising medical industry and the restrictive roles of women. Medical attitudes towards women's bodies initially reflected social attitudes, but it eventually distorted them. By the 19th century, attitudes towards the hypothetical, biological differences between men and women and the changes in scientific knowledge and medical involvement, one gains an appreciation of how today is happening the way it is today. That's the end of my article, and I have a lot of footnotes in it, and I have, of course, a bibliography. In fact, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of endnotes. So my footnotes, I had 129 references within my article to articles that were very well established and that any of you can access. And then I provide a bibliography, and I have 2 pages in my bibliography, all of references. So this work has been extremely well referenced. I spent about 30 hours writing this article. I was back in 2000. Of course, I got an A. Just bragging here. But my point is, this is so relevant today, especially when we're looking at things energetically. And we look at the energy and the divine feminine. We have been so dominated by a patriarchal system for so long. Now, this has nothing to do with individuals. Men are not bad. Men are not the problem. Women are not bad. Women are not the problem. The problem is we have all fallen for a divide and conquer mentality. We have allowed ourselves to be manipulated. We have allowed ourselves to end up in this current environment. And now I'm encouraging you to take your power. You know, I just had pneumonia. I was very, very sick. The doctor prescribed antibiotics, steroids, and also a puffer that was also steroids. But you know what? I just stayed in bed and rested. And I played nice music and I watched Netflix. And I ate very little until I could get up and cook. And then I made chicken soup. And you know what? 4 weeks later, I was just right as rain. And then you had another 2 weeks just, to get my strength back. And I did it all myself. I took no pills. And my doctor, boy, was he pissed. And now I go see him for something. He goes, well, why are you telling me? I can't do anything about it. Literally, without his prescription pad, he can't help me. He won't help me. And that's based on the beliefs. Thank God I know how to take care of myself, obviously. But I just want to shake you guys up a little bit. Take back your medical power. Take a chance on going to see a healer. When you go see a healer, you're healing yourself. The healer is just a facilitator, okay? Heal. Allow yourselves to heal. Stop buying into the bullshit. Wake up. Find out where all this crap's coming from that we're believing in. Throw it out and let's get some new beliefs going. So the next podcast won't be dealing with the history of medicine, but probably be going into a little bit more of the modern context because it's still suppressing the divine feminine. Those pharma pills, they're shutting down people's pineal glands. They're stopping the ascension. We got to know about it. Then we can make an informed choice. And then at the end, we can go, okay, I screwed up, or hooray, I didn't screw up. Depending. It's our life journey. We get out of it what we want. So take care of your health, everybody. Love you so much. Bye-bye.
Surrendering to endlessness puts all my inner strife to rest. For time gives birth to hurriedness. It all makes sense, well, more or less, and the sages put me to their test. With heart and soul I do my best to find the answers to my quest. I wonder and I must confess, I don't know where it comes from, but I know it's okay. If this is all an illusion, then I'm willing to play, 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 play. It's okay. It's okay.